Over time, we have seen that Western liberal democracy is moving towards systems which support the most free choice possible. As a society, we have limited the amount of influence that institutions can have over our voters. The one institution that hasn't sufficiently had its power checked is the church, and we think that that is actually what the motion before the House today targets. So it is on that basis that I'm going to be presenting you with two lines of constructive analysis. Firstly, that on the separation of powers. Secondly, that of the changing political landscape. What you're going to see from the Deputy Prime Minister is our third line of analysis on first government, that being on social dichotomization. But before I get into my constructive case today, let's actually take a look at the model, and let's actually look at why we think that this policy is not only beneficial to implement, but is also feasible before the House today. Firstly, we think that this model targets religious leaders such as like rabbis in a synagogue or priests in church, individuals that actually have a lot of influence over people of a particular religion, ladies and gentlemen. We think the political candidates that we're dealing with are individuals who are running for office. What do we mean by endorse? We think that endorse means either offering money, subjecting encouragement to a particular populace, or we think it's actually pushing a particular demographic or group of people towards a particular political platform, ladies and gentlemen. Ultimately, what we want to see is a system where religious leaders do not reveal their political bias. That's what we're going to be advocating on First Government today. We think that this debate is relevant today in Western liberal democracies because we think that those are the systems where this is actually feasible to be implemented. I'm going to be looking at that in my constructive analysis as well. Okay, let's take a look at this first line of analysis I'm going to be getting into, that on the separation of powers. I'm going to look at it with three subpoints. Firstly, the nature of religion. Secondly, free choice. And finally, government action. So to begin, when we look at the nature of religion, we think that it's something where people are actually going to follow their local or religious leader because we think that that leader, that religious leader, is actually symbolic of the tenets of those particular people's faith, ladies and gentlemen. And we think it's relatively cohesive on that front. Because of the influence that that individual has over a particular group of people, we think that that's actually why those individuals may be more inclined to vote along the lines that that leader has in the first place. We looked at some systems that have actually already separated church and state and why that's been beneficial. So we looked to like England, for example, where they've actually separated the Church of England from the political process because they recognize that having a religious institution, having a role over the people where they can actually influence the political scheme of that country is harmful. Let's take a look at the second subpoint, free choice. Well, we think that Western liberal democratic systems generally tend to be those that actually uphold the free choice of voters. Why is that actually compromised when you have religious leaders that are pushing individuals towards voting along certain party lines? Well, we think that those individuals actually have impaired judgment because they're going to be likely to vote along the religious lines because that leader is symbolic of the tenets of their faith. We think that what happens now is that voters actually lose their autonomy within the system because they're inclined and pushed by a leader which does have a larger influence over them than they're capable of saying no to. We look at the status quo, so we look at corporations, for example, and how under the status quo, we already actually cap the amount of money that a corporation can use to actually back voters, right? So we see that under the status quo, we've already taken measures to limit the amount of power that foreign institutions or other institutions have over voters. We think that this motion is actually a further extenuation of that and actually limits the one group that hasn't been properly checked. Finally, let's look at the sub-facet of government action. So we think that currently, in some countries, the government and the church are too linked, and we think that that's actually what results in policies being biased towards a particular religion. We think that that actually harms minority groups within certain countries. Let's look at this second argument, but before I do that, let's take a peek.
Wouldn't you agree that in democracy, the minorities' views are not as well represented as the majorities?
Yes, I think that sometimes the minority's views are not as represented as the majority, but we also think that it's the role of a Western liberal democratic institution to ensure that the views of the minorities are as best represented as possible. And we think that by having the church and state linked and by having religious leaders being able to back political candidates, you're actually harming the minority group. Let's take a look at my second argument, that of changing the political landscape. Well, firstly, political catering. We think that actually political individuals and candidates are going to be more likely to cater towards the needs of like religious groups because those are now the individuals who hold the power. We think that they're actually going to throw money at them and we think that they're going to throw religious beliefs at them. We think that this actually results in a disproportionation of power because we think that religion now gains more power under the status quo than it should be allowed to gain because you now have political candidates that are actually working hand in hand with religious individuals, and this creates that disproportion of power where religious groups actually hold more power over the political system. Finally, we think that this results in an altered political scheme in a particular country, where politics are actually dominated by a particular religion, and we don't actually think that they're necessarily, that party in place in the Western liberal democracy is no longer the party in place that is actually best to rule that country, right? They may no longer be, and we think that this inherently harms the political process. What you're going to see on the last argument from First Government is actually how this disproportionation of power and having one religious group actually alters the social scheme as well. So for the reasons we brought to you today, we beg to propose. Thank you.